Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're embarking on a deep dive into a profoundly important and critically acclaimed work, Saburō Ienaga's The Pacific War, World War II and the Japanese, 1931 and 1945. And this isn't just, a chronicle of battles. Ienaga offers a really deeply human perspective. He meticulously explores the intricate how and why Japan waged a total war for, a staggering 15 years, from 1931 right through to 1945, and perhaps most importantly, the devastating impact this had on its own people.
And that's precisely our mission with this deep dive, isn't it? To extract the most vital insights from Ienaga's very unique Japanese viewpoint. He explicitly challenges what he calls sugar-coated history. He's really pushing us to understand that Japan's current peace and prosperity, they have deep, complex roots in its own fascist and aggressive past. His ultimate aim, as he states it, is to ensure future generations never repeat those costly errors. So we'll chronologically explore several intertwining threads throughout this discussion: Japan's relentless imperialist expansion, the severe suppression of civil liberties and critical thinking back home, the military's pervasive and frankly often irrational influence, and the complex, often heartbreaking nature of civilian dissent and suffering during a total war.
It's a huge subject. A 15-year military adventure, as Ienaga terms it.
Yeah.
Where does he actually begin the story for Japan? Because, many consider World War II to have started later.
Right. That's a crucial distinction Ienaga makes. For Japan, he argues, the conflict truly began way back in 1931 with the Manchurian incident. But what's really fascinating here is how he traces Japan's imperialistic path back even further than that. His core insight is that this deep-seated contempt for weaker nations, a kind of might makes right mentality, it was foundational. He points to the 1876 Kanwa Treaty, which was forced on Korea, ironically quite similar to the unequal treaties the West had imposed on Japan itself decades earlier.
Okay.
Then you have the early 20th century acquisitions, Formosa, Taiwan, and the Kwantung Concession. These really solidified a sense of Japanese superiority and, fueled even bigger plans for expansion. And Ienaga shows how this was actually woven into popular culture. Even songs had this racist contempt for the Chinese, using terms like pig-tailed chinks.
Wow.
Yeah, and lyrics describing, quote, Chinese soldiers massacred everywhere, what a sight. These disturbing sentiments, he argues, absolutely foreshadowed the later atrocities.
So, that's the external expansion. But Ienaga also digs deep into the internal situation, right? How the government managed to create a society where that kind of aggression wasn't just tolerated, but actively embraced.
That's an absolutely critical question about the internal machinery. Ienaga meticulously details the systematic dismantling of civil liberties under the Meiji Constitution. Freedoms of speech, publication, assembly thought they were recognized only within the limits of the law, which in practice meant they could be pretty arbitrarily suppressed by the police, often with criminal penalties.
So not real freedoms at all, then?
Essentially, no. He gives chilling examples like the banning of the Social Democratic Party back in 1901 just for advocating popular suffrage and disarmament, or the 1910 conspiracy trial being used as a pretext to prohibit all publications on socialism, including anti-imperialist books, even anti-war foreign films, like All Quiet on the Western Front. They were heavily censored. Ienaga's point is that this wasn't just about controlling information, it was about fundamentally eroding the ability to think independently.
Right. It's one thing to suppress dissent, but you mentioned Ienaga suggests the state went even further, actively shaping citizens' minds, starting really young. How did that indoctrination actually work?
Yeah, this is where Ienaga's analysis gets particularly stark. From 1904 onwards, elementary school textbooks were all centrally compiled by the Ministry of Education.
Right. Central control.
Exactly. So this meant a uniform, unquestioning outlook was literally stamped onto young minds across the whole nation. Education drilled in values of unconditional obedience to the state, focusing on loyalty to the emperor and love of country. Children were taught to despise pig-tailed chinks. They were shown pictures, he says, of Chinese corpses piled up as high as a mountain.
God, that's horrifying.
It is. And lessons like one titled, Takeo Joins the Service, explicitly prepared boys, to be not afraid to die. Military training was built right into schools, with active duty officers involved. It fundamentally shaped a generation that, Ienaga argues, just lacked the ability to think critically or question authority. It wasn't just propaganda, it was a deep system designed to produce compliant, militaristic citizens.
And this systematic indoctrination, it seems like it ties directly into the military itself. Ienaga portrays it as this uniquely authoritarian, often irrational force, almost like a state within a state. How did that power manifest?
Well, what's really illuminating when you connect the dots is the military's incredibly powerful institutional position. This prerogative of supreme command meant it operated almost completely independently of the Diet, the civilian government.
Mm-hmm.
This gave them huge leverage. I mean, the military could actually bring down cabinets just by refusing to appoint a service minister. We saw that in 1912 with the Uehara Isaka incident. And Ienaga gives these specific, quite stark examples of gikokujo, that's the overthrow of seniors by junior men.
Right, I remember that term.
Yeah, junior officers plotted major actions, like the Manchurian incident, completely without formal orders from Tokyo. And astonishingly, even senior generals often refused to punish these conspirators. They just transfer them to new, important jobs instead. Ienaga argues this wasn't just insubordination. It was a symptom of this deeply embedded culture where military ambition often just trampled civilian oversight and even, rational command structure.
That's a really powerful picture of a military out of control.
Yeah.
You mentioned the insubordination. Did Ienaga talk about whether this irrationality went deeper, maybe into the military's core philosophy, beyond just structure?
Oh, absolutely. Ienaga contends that the military's whole mental outlook was deeply reactionary. They clung to this excessive emphasis on spiritization over scientific rationality, even as warfare was clearly modernizing. The 1908 Army Criminal Code, for instance, actually stipulated death penalties for commanders who allowed their units to surrender without fighting to the last man.
Death penalty for surrendering.
Yes. This mindset, he argues, led to just a wanton waste of Japanese lives, especially when fighting Allied forces who, prioritize scientific and tactical approaches. He gives this compelling comparison. The Kwantar Army trained for round-the-clock combat with this singular focus on spirit, while the Americans kept regular fighting hours and, frankly, achieved more. Ienaga uses this to highlight the fundamental, really fatal flaw of rejecting rational planning in favor of this misguided spiritualism.
Okay, so with that internal structure and that mindset, the aggression just kept expanding. How did Ienaga describe Japan's move from Manchuria into China proper and then eventually out into the Pacific?
Well, the Mukden incident in 1931, which Ienaga is clear was orchestrated by the Kwantung Army, that was the pretext for grabbing Manchuria. Then, not wanting to be left out, the Navy soon wanted its own glory, which led to the Shanghai incident in 1932. Japan then set up the puppet state of Manchukuo. By 1937, you get the full-scale war in China proper starting. This was marked by Japan just refusing to deal with Chiang Kai-shek and setting up various puppet regimes instead. Ienaga also details how international responses, they largely failed. You had criticism from the League of Nations, sure, but also early US and UK appeasement. They often saw Japan as a sort of bulwark against communism.
Which just emboldened them, presumably.
Exactly. It failed to curb Tokyo's actions and arguably emboldened them.
And this path, ultimately, it snowballed into the wider Pacific War, especially as relations with the Western powers really soured.
Precisely. The US, the UK, and Holland eventually hit back by freezing Japanese assets and imposing a crippling oil embargo. Japan saw this as an ABCD encirclement. American, British, Chinese, Dutch. So Japan, facing severe resource shortages and feeling unable to just withdraw from China, felt it had no choice but to expand the war to grab those resources. This, Ienaga argues, led directly to the attack on Pearl Harbor. And he highlights this incredible paradox. Japanese admirals apparently agreed to a war they had no real confidence of winning, partly out of fear of an army revolt if they backed down.
Wow, that's quite something.
Isn't it? And what's more, the actual war declaration intentionally left out any calls for compliance with international law. It was a clear signal of departure from established norms.
Ienaga also dedicates significant time to the sheer brutality of the war itself. How does he illustrate what he calls the horrors of war, going beyond just the military conflict?
Yeah, this is a truly crucial and very sobering part of Ienaga's work. He absolutely does not shy away from the horrific realities. He details widespread atrocities, arguing they weren't just accidental slip-ups, but a direct reflection of the military's profound moral degeneration. The infamous rape of Nanking, the systematic mass slaughter and rape, stands out as a prime example of this total dehumanization.
It's horrific.
And then there's Unit 731, this clandestine bacteriological warfare research unit that conducted horrifying human experiments, injecting prisoners with bacteria, dropping plague bombs on them, even using human guinea pigs for frostbite tests. He also reveals that at Kyushu Imperial University, captured U.S. airmen were actually subjected to vivisection experiments.
Vivisection. While
Yes. Having organs removed, knives inserted into their skulls while still alive. Ienaga also extensively documents the comfort girls, many of them Korean, forced into sexual slavery. Chinese prisoners of war, he notes, were used for forced labor, treated literally like animals, and even subjected to live target practice. His core insight is that these acts were a direct consequence of the military's unchecked power and its warped ideology.
It's truly difficult to comprehend that level of suffering. And this wasn't just happening far away for the Japanese military. Ienaga also shows immense suffering on the home front, too, doesn't he?
Absolutely. While the war maybe initially stimulated some industries, it very quickly led to severe shortages of food, consumer goods, a flourishing black market, and sharply declining real wages for ordinary Japanese people. Women and children were forced into long hours in factories. Ienaga really emphasizes how the state mobilized students and young women for war production, essentially denying an entire generation their right to education to a normal development.
A lost generation, in a way.
Very much so. He recounts with great empathy the mass evacuation of children from cities, often separated from their families, living in constant hunger, facing enormous emotional strain. His narrative here isn't just about, economic hardship. It's about the profound societal cost and the human toll of total war on the civilians.
Given this picture of intense suffering and total state control, Ienaga also talks about pockets of dissent and resistance. How did people actually respond to this incredibly oppressive system?
Well, despite the very heavy hand of the state, Ienaga does meticulously identify various forms of resistance. It wasn't widespread, but it existed. There was some legal opposition from Christian pacifists and liberal intellectuals like Ishibashi Tenzan, who bravely argued against military adventurism and tried to champion free speech. He also highlights Yanahara Tadao, who kept advocating Christian pacifism in private magazines like Kashin. He even implicitly criticized the Nanking atrocities and the Triple Alliance with Germany and Italy.
That must have been incredibly risky.
Extremely. And Masaki Hiroshi, another notable figure, used really scathing irony in his journal Chikaki Yori to attack figures like Premier Tuju and condemn the irrationality of suicide tactics as a debasement of human life. Ienaga's insight here is that while these voices were definitely suppressed, they show that critical thought and a moral conscience weren't entirely stamped out.
So there were these voices, however small they seemed against the state. Did Ienaga find other kinds of resistance too?
Yes, definitely. He also points to more passive resistance, like scholars who continued critical research in secret, confident that, as one put it, our spirit will be taken up by the next generation.
Mm-hmm.
And there was active, though limited, illegal resistance. Anonymous letters were sent to authorities condemning the emperor or the war. Graffiti sometimes appeared in public toilets calling for revolution or assassinations.
Really? Even graffiti?
Apparently so. And there were even some desertions from the military. Perhaps most significantly, Japanese prisoners of war held in China actually formed anti-war leagues. They actively appealed to Japanese troops still fighting to surrender. Ienaga uses these examples, scattered as they are, to show that even in such a highly controlled society, human agency and the desire for peace, they couldn't be entirely wiped out.
Right. Given all this suffering, the suppression, the eventual defeat, what was the ultimate consequence for Japan, and what did Ienaga really hope readers would take away from this harrowing history?
Well, Ienaga argues Japan's defeat was comprehensive. It wasn't just military. He highlights strategic blunders like the Battle of Midway, the disastrous Imphal campaign in Burma, and he attributes them directly to that irrational overemphasis on spirit instead of, technological understanding and rational planning. But his most profound insight, perhaps, regarding the surrender itself is this. He believes it was primarily motivated by the ruling elite's fear of domestic unrest, their desire to preserve the national polity, that is, the emperor system.
Not primarily concerned for the people suffering.
Not primarily, according to Ienaga, which is tragic because that suffering continued even after the atomic bombings. It really emphasizes the self-serving nature of the leadership, even right at the very end.
And so out of that devastation came the 1947 Constitution, with its foundational principles of popular sovereignty, human rights, and peace. That became the blueprint for a new Japan.
Exactly. And Ienaga believes that the understanding that Japan's current peace and prosperity are deeply rooted in the fascism and aggression of the 1930s and 40s is absolutely vital. His core purpose in writing the Pacific War was really to remind younger generations, those with no direct experience of these horrors, that ignorance of the past could very easily lead to repeating it. He sought to kind of rekindle idealism and dedication to building and maintaining a truly free and peaceful society. His work is a powerful, powerful call to vigilance.
As we wrap up this deep dive, Ienaga's powerful message really resonates beyond just Japan, doesn't it? That the living memory of the horrors of war and the critical thinking that came after the conflict are what truly sustained Japan's pacifism and democracy today.
And this raises, I think, an important question for all of us, not just Japan. How do we, as societies, ensure that uncomfortable truths about our own histories are faced directly rather than, sugar-coated? How do we make sure that the sacrifices and the lessons of the past truly serve as a bulwark against future errors? It's a constant challenge, isn't it, to remain vigilant, to stay critically engaged long after the direct experience of conflict has faded, in order to preserve the principles that were born from such immense suffering.